Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Cryptocurrency Basics, Part 2. Part 1 is out on the Facebook channel and the YouTube channel. We're picking up where we left off right here. We are broadcasting live, so Jay, can you give us a quick introduction, and then I think you're already off to the races, so pick it up wherever you like.
Yeah, I'm a blockchain engineer for MetalPay, and we're a payment processor crypto play, so please check it out. And I'll get started. All right. So this is Cryptocurrencies Basics Part 2, and here I'll cover some of the fundamental problems, what the mitigations are, and some of the problems that cryptocurrencies solve, and what problems cryptocurrencies are not designed to solve. So Satoshi Nakamoto said that the root problem, the conventional currency, is that it requires trust at all to work. And Bitcoin has been working in the last few years, and it's been working fairly flawlessly in terms of the core currency, core security. So I think he's got it to work, or maybe it's shame, I don't know. So big problems. So cryptocurrencies have to solve what's called a double spending problem, and that's basically what we discussed earlier, where I send somebody $10, and before that gets written into my ledger somewhere, I also send that $10 to someone else, and thereby spending $20, $10 more than I had. And the way that it's solved in Bitcoin is that there's a sort of strict accounting bottleneck, and that's handled through blockchain, and adding the records onto a blockchain, and then solving a very difficult math problems with a grading, with a different grade of difficulties, and then appending that record in a linear fashion. And so that in a sense, it's very similar to how banks operate, except banks actually go into your account and subtract the amount. Bitcoin doesn't do that. It actually just keeps on appending into a linear history, and then the transaction records are just that. It just shows you the amount spent, and not it doesn't have a record of the individual account's balance. So Bitcoin doesn't have a innate built-in concept of balance that only comes out as a consequence of running through the history. So, and Bitcoin also utilizes signed transactions to ensure that we know where the transaction origin is from, or at least the address that's assigned to it. So cryptocurrencies in general have public addresses where you can send the aforementioned tokens or coins, and then the individual addresses have private keys so that you can actually claim those. So cryptocurrencies and a lot of fundamental problems in computer science, a lot of the applications have to solve what's called Byzantine generals problem, and that's sort of there's a different classes of Byzantine generals problem. One is consensus, the other is the deciding when to decide, knowing the quorum. So if there are sort of like a board of directors and there's nobody showing up, and only director that showed up made a decision, that's not a quorum. So similar to that, Bitcoin, because there are problems of what gets written and when, and there has to be a solution to that. And how it's done is through sort of a genius combination of economic incentive and mathematics, what people now call Nakamoto consensus. The PBFT, that's just a practical Byzantine fault-tolerant algorithm that's not being used in Bitcoin. That's just another way to solve a similar problem. Now, Nakamoto consensus actually focuses on making sure that the attackers, there's an incentive structure that encourages people to remain honest, and honest players have higher hashing power, computing power overall than the attackers. And I'll cover that in detail because that's a very sort of subtle point. So Sybil attack or Sybil attack, depending on how you pronounce it, it has to do with sock puppets. So it's like you have sock puppets and they're talking on your behalf or acting on your behalf, or acting on behalf of malicious actors. So what that means is that in case of sort of like decentralized currency where anybody can broadcast transactions and all that stuff, you really can't have a security model that trusts any single node at all, which means that you have to assume everybody is malicious in the Bitcoin network. And because of that, you need to have a mechanism to clear the transaction without assigning any single node the right of writing into the collective ledger. And the way that that's done is partly to make the attacks marginally more expensive, so that in aggregate, the forged transactions and broadcasting them and having them sort of like transacted, those are kind of expensive, because when you send a transaction, you have to include a fee. And if you include a fee in Bitcoin network, if someone solves it, then that's done. If you send out a invalid transaction, all you're just wasting your own electricity. So what's happening is there's a concept called proof of work that basically says that, okay, I've lined up all the transactions and I have all the signatures that I'm going to validate. And after that, I'm going to take the entire transaction and put it through a hash function. So the body of transaction is called a digest, and you take that digest and shove it through a hash function, and then it'll output a random-looking group of letters. Now, Bitcoin has a very specific rule that says that in order for you to have been considered a solver of that block, you have to have zeros in front of it, 60 digits or 120 digits or whatever it is. And in order to have that number of zeros lined up in sequential fashion, it's very low probability. And that is what's increasing the cost of attack, by making sure that people who are validating these transactions are honest brokers, and all they want to do is validate the transaction. So there's I'm going a little bit aside, and that's the problem that cryptocurrencies sort of solve. And part of it is there's a problem called a principal agent problem, and that is that there's a difference between principal who gives authority to agent to act on his or her behalf, and there's always this uncertain dynamics as to whether the agent is going to execute exactly your intent, and that has to do with anything. Like if you have a real estate agent, is he really working for you, or is he trying to get more commission? You really don't know. So cryptocurrency and certain classes of cryptocurrency solve this by having smart contracts, and in other cases, even without smart contracts, you can have sort of like an escrow-like system where you have neutral ground where it requires both sides' signature in order to clear the fund, so to speak. So like without both payer A and payer B's signature, the funds don't clear. So then that mitigates it. So that's sort of like an automated escrow settlement. And having a very narrowly defined contract also helps resolve that problem. So this is more of sort of like practical considerations, much more so than fundamental problem that cryptocurrency solve. But this is sort of where the focus of activity has been, especially now with the Ethereum and all the other smart contract companies that are coming up. So for greater privacy, you want to use Bitcoin address only once. That's what Satoshi Nakamoto said. And there's a very good reason for that. So in cryptocurrency, you think that it's anonymous, but it's not. It's actually, in Bitcoin's case, it's publicly available, right? You have ledgers that are inspectable by anybody. You can go from time 0 to now and see who sent what to whom, at least the address was. But there are really good ways to figure out who's who by doing what's called fingerprinting. And that has to do with, okay, well, what are some of the exchange endpoints or exit points? What are some of the economic activities that this sort of chain of transactions have taken place? And so you can kind of reconstruct who owns what and who did what. It's not trivial, but it's also not impossible. It's actually fairly straightforward once you understand how the transactions work. So you can actually figure out spending habits if you know the wallet addresses of vendors. And by knowing that and knowing the origin, you can reconstruct who spent what. So it's pseudonymous. So going back to the transaction origin discovery, there is a way, essentially, if you connect to every single Bitcoin nodes out there, you can figure out who's who, because you'll know that just by looking at the time difference between who sent out the transaction record and broadcast to network when that person is the originator of that particular record. So it's not, it's not rocket science. And maybe there are like 200,000 wallets out there, maybe something like that. I don't know the exact number, but yeah, you can figure it out. And Dan Kaminsky did a fantastic talk back in 2011 about how that might be done and how you can actually figure out who owns what, or at the very least, who sent what amount to whom. And by knowing the IP address, then thereby you may be able to be discovered. So yeah, please go check that out. It's a really fantastic talk. But there are other ways around it. So there are fundamental algorithms that help you keep your privacy, and that has to do with something called zero-knowledge proof. And the way that zero-knowledge proof works is that based on initial state, the subsequent state can be verified even though you don't necessarily know the amount that's being transacted and so on and so forth. It's a little bit beyond my pay grade, but I'm still like racking my head around it. But the Zcash is one that actually uses zero-knowledge proof, and it's been audited over and over. And it's deemed to be pretty solid, rock solid. The only downside to that is that Zcash, at the time zero, they have to do what's called a key generation ceremony, which means that they have a group of people that generate some sort of initial key to initialize the state of the network. And they then burned all the keys and destroyed the computer that generated it. And these are honest people, but you never really know whether one of them kept their CDs. But in all honesty, it seems like, at least from all the parties that were involved, all the keys were destroyed. But that's just what we know about it. So other cryptocurrencies solve the problem differently. So Monero uses ring transactions, and Bitcoin and other can use CoinJoin. And basically, CoinJoin is sort of like, let's all pull the transactions together and then send it out in a haphazard way so that you can't really track who sent what transaction to whom. But then I'm not a lawyer, so please don't shoot me. I don't know, are you then an accessory to crime? If you somehow figure out that part of the output transaction from that CoinJoin operation is funding terrorists, I don't know. So maybe that's an interesting problem to explore. There's not a whole lot of consensus on Tor, but at least we know that there are law enforcement that has their eyes on the exit nodes of Tor, so they can tell that transactions went through their gateway. Maybe they don't know who it is, but they'll know. So I'm going to move on to sort of like more practical aspect of it. So there's problems in operation. Block propagation speed. It's only 2 lines here, but I swear to you, this is sort of like the most contentious aspect of Bitcoin, and it's still contentious, and there's flame wars about. And that has to do with, remember we talked about block as a collection of transactions. And Bitcoin has a very small block. I think it's like 1 megabyte or whatever. And you collect that, and depending on sort of how big the signature is, you can only fit about like 2,400 of them or something like that. I don't know the exact number. And so which means that there is a throughput limit to how many transactions can be cleared and verified. And that's the reason why you hear a lot of people saying, oh, it took 8 hours, 10 hours for my Bitcoin to go from point A to point B, or that I had to spend $50 on fees and just to send $9 worth of Bitcoin or something like that, right? But there is a reason why sort of blocks are small, and that has to do with the security of the network. So the Bitcoin focuses more on the security side rather than the like how fast it can transact. And yeah, that's a little bit weird. Like we're used to like Apple Pay transacting immediately, and we think, yeah, what's up? Why is this the future, or are we going back in time? So like this is debatable, of course, but mitigation is smaller blocks, off-chain transactions like Lightning Network, and so on and so forth. And I'll cover Lightning Network and how that sort of operates in a little bit in detail if you guys are interested. This is a largely solved problem, at least in Bitcoin, but there are other cryptocurrencies like recently IOTA that had this issue. And malleability basically is if you have a record, something that you wrote, and then you encrypt it, and it has certain collection of characters, right? Now, if you took if the what you wrote is sort of like formatted or structured, like origin, destination, time, and amount, then because of that format, when you send a subsequent change or different message of the similar format, you're only changing one field, right? Either time or amount or whatever. So like you're changing a small set of the field. Because you're changing the small set of field, if the cipher doesn't encrypt it in a way that there's no distinguishable way to distinguish between one versus another, even if you change one bit of the small information in the formatted fashion, then that's called malleable. So like just by changing like one number in the transaction, because you have access to the the cipher function, you can actually then kind of back engineer how it's going to work if the cipher, if the encryption method is malleable. So how does that even fit into Bitcoin? Okay, so how that works is, let's say that you are a exchange, okay, and you want to transact quickly, right? If someone deposits money, you want to make it show up in their account quickly. So let's say you're Mt. Gox, and you want to get more customers quickly and increase the velocity of money internal to your system. So then what happens is you might be tempted to say, okay, well, if the block's been broadcasted, even if it's not been completely verified, I'm going to accept it, and then I'll worry about clawing back the amount later. So which means that if someone say I broadcast a transaction, and then someone was listening in on it, they can take that and say, okay, it probably fits a certain pattern. I'm going to change a very small portion of it, and I'm just going to spam the network with that broadcast. And because earlier a lot of the wallet providers weren't checking the format of the transaction signature, or at least the transaction ID portion of the signature, it created a habit, which means that because Bitcoin network is decentralized, you also have to relay the transaction from one person to another, and it could get to some destination at some point. And rebroadcast is a legitimate function. So which means if I took your transaction record and I changed something and rebroadcast it, now there's no way to easily track back to the originator. So even though the transaction actually is valid and your Bitcoin is subtracted and someone else gets the Bitcoin, so the transaction is valid, but it's just the annoyance. Like the fact if you have a wallet application, you want to be able to see who sent what to whom easily. And malleability is that problem. In other cryptocurrencies, that's a more serious problem. So mitigation is if you're a commercial operator, do not accept unconfirmed transactions. That's no-brainer, but people still do it. Enforce very strict formatting check for signatures, and separate the signature ID from transaction. That's sort of like built into the system now, called segregated witness. And what that does is Bitcoin transactions have signature and transaction body. now they've sort of figured out a very clever way to separate it out, and that helps with the valuability problem. Okay, so gonna move on. I mean, if you want to ask about one-time pad, I have it in there, but if you're particularly interested in that, I'd be happy to talk to you about it. And I put that as an example. So this is a tricky problem, and it's more of a problem in operation, more so than it's due to the applications that people have written, and it's called fund hostage taking. And so we talked about sort of like this neutral ground where you have wallets that require both sides' signature in order to have it cleared, and it's often used in things like cross-chain atomic swaps, and that's just a fancy way of saying you have Ethereum or Ether, I have Bitcoin. How do we exchange it without one party letting go of their token or coin first? So then they need some sort of intermediary, which is neither of them, but have a way to transact, and that's sort of done in automated fashion. They can do it in automated fashion, but so in order to use that with code and multi-signature wallet, they sort of have, if one side doesn't let go of the fund or agree to let go of the fund, then there's no recourse, and that's called a hostage taking, because then I deposited 10,000 bitcoins, and they deposit 10,000 bitcoins, and just out of spite, they don't want to release the fund, and we're both out of 10,000 each. But that's a pretty trivial problem to solve. And basically that's handled in sort of what's called a hash time-lapse contracts. And it's just a very fancy way of saying there's an expiry. When it expires, people get their money back. So there's sort of like time to perform. And if they don't agree to do a transaction, then everybody get their money back. And that's actually used in Lightning Network as well. Now, when you're designing anything that deals with sort of like automated system and escrow, you have to design the system very carefully to prevent hostage taking, and more importantly, you have to design it to prevent draining the sort of the escrow account. And that's what happened to the original DAO. So DAO, for those of you who are new to this, is distributed autonomous organizations. And that's basically, well, we have all the makings of all the ways to ensure sort of organizations in cyberspace to continue just by depositing money and making it so that people can vote on how the money is going to be used. So that's basically what DAO is. And it's just corporation in a different form and different governance. So there was a really famous hack that nearly broke how Ethereum is perceived and still perceived today. And that's basically, there was a bug in the code that allowed someone to split. Well, so primary feature of a DAO has to do with voluntary exit. So when you deposit money into a DAO, and that fund can grow, and you can elect to say, well, I want to exit, I want to split. And when you say, I want to split, they basically give you, your money back or a portion of the money back, subtract your account balance from that DAO smart contract, and say goodbye. Now, the problem with that is the codes were somewhat buggy, and someone found an exploit around it. Basically, it has to do with, under certain circumstances, before the balances are taken care of, you can again ask for a split, which means you keep on asking for a split, and you keep on withdrawing money, and the general fund is emptied out. And that's what the DAO hack was. It was a fairly sophisticated, well, I don't know what the jury is out, but it was known bug at the time, but they didn't fix it in time. But that it basically tells us that whenever you design a system that is automated escrow or some sort of like organization, you need to make it so that you need to audit it. You need to understand how it works. You need to understand how someone might, drain your account. And I'm not sure if the the people that designed it, as brilliant as they are, have gone through the entire step, and they were very close to solving it too. So it's not entirely their fault, but the consequences of that is actually immense, and I'll cover that later. So going back to the old world, we still have counterparty risk. There's no way around it, and transacting on chain, so to speak, and the record transaction and clearance on cryptocurrencies are generally pretty secure, depending on the cryptocurrency. Bitcoin more so, IOTA maybe, I don't know, we don't know. But the counterparty risk in most cases are not always just like BitConnect, right? Like someone creates a pyramid scheme and people just deposit money in it, and they said, oh, you should be able to get some quote unquote fixed rate of return, which is of course no such thing as free lunch. But yeah, that's an exit scam. But cryptocurrencies are not all about exit scams. I mean, there are legitimate projects, obviously, otherwise you guys wouldn't be here. But there are also legitimate counterparty risk in cases where there are disputes. And one of them is Lightning Network. And because you are a Lightning Network, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is we talked about sort of Bitcoin transactions taking very long time, like say, in certain cases, hours. And it's pay-to-play network. So if you pay a lot of fee, your transactions get miners are going to take that transaction record, group it into a block, and try to solve that block first, so that they can get that high transaction fees as part of their reward. Now, in order to increase throughput, certain group of people have gotten together and wrote a really fantastic paper, and I forget the names, so please excuse me. And they wrote basically what's called the Lightning Network protocol, and it has to do with off-chain transaction and then settling it on-chain after certain, and then aggregating the transaction. Basically going back to sort of like a bank idea, right? But the difference is that it's all done in a sort of like neutral ground without anybody being able to write arbitrary record of your transaction, like a bank, or clawing back the money and that sort of thing. So Lightning Network is sort of like separated network that has connections through Lightning Network nodes. And what you do is essentially you deposit a little bit of money into the Lightning Network, and then you say, well, I want to give somebody 200 Satoshis, and it will transact that 200 Satoshi. And then after you transact more and more and more, let's say 1 Bitcoin's worth, then they basically say, okay, well, we're going to settle that account on chain. And that money that you immobilized and put it into Lightning Network, now we're going to give it to whoever you have to settle with. So it's a way to aggregate the transactions and then settle the accounts in a more efficient way. So it's basically a batching. And because of that, there is a counterparty risk. So for example, if one of the nodes, basically, I don't want to transport your money. Like I don't want to be the gateway for your transaction, or I don't want to do anything. So there needs to be a way to prevent hostage taking. So that network has a way to deal with that. But also the difference of accounting as to like one node to another, like you want to make sure that the end state is the same. And so if I spend 1 Bitcoin, I should be subtracted 1 Bitcoin. So what happens if someone says, I didn't, this person didn't spend 1 Bitcoin, but half a Bitcoin. So if there's a different account that's been transmitted, then what happens? So there actually is a way to solve it, and that's called a penalty. And the money that you deposited into the system, the part of that, if node incorrectly broadcasts a transaction in the end state, there's a dispute resolution, and then automated dispute resolution actually credit you that amount of Bitcoin that you shouldn't have been penalized for. So there's a way to do that. Now, in case of Ripple, because Ripple is a very cleverly designed system, and it handles sort of like debt obligations and different kind of financial obligations. and it propagates that obligation throughout the network, you can also build on top of that your own currency, right? You can use your own currency and whatnot, or you can have sort of like different like instruments. Now, when you do that, let's say you have your own token and you're the issuing gateway, and you default on your obligations. Then what happens? Then you're sort of like screwed. You have all these useless tokens, and you can't transact network. So then you just have to send lawyers and figure out who were the offending party. So they kind of actually said that in their talk in the one of the C++ conferences. They had one of their CTOs, and they talked about sort of like, okay, well, there are real life consequences, and that's how we solve it. Okay, yeah, and then these are problems not solved by cryptocurrencies. A lot of people ask this on occasion, and I actually answered it last time too. And so there are 2 or 3 items that I'll cover. First is reputation. At least in Bitcoin, there is no privileged party. There's no nodes that are, quote unquote, more reputable than other. There is a way. I mean, there's no in-network way to determine that reputation. And the reason for it is that you start with a state that basically says that you can't trust any node. None of the nodes are trustworthy, and therefore you're not going to assign any special treatment for any of them. And they all have the same rights of broadcasting and receiving transactions and putting them together and rebroadcasting. So then, decentralization as those actually takes hold, and it seems to work. Now, the thing is that now you can actually have a layer on top of it, and you can say, well, these nodes that I've been monitoring very closely seem to be kind of sketchy, so I'm not going to listen to their broadcast or whatever. You can do that, but why? It makes no sense, right? Because you actually want to listen to as many nodes as possible, and the reason for that is that as a miner, all you care about is transaction, whether they're valid and whether they can be verified. And if they are verifiable, then who cares, right? So the built-in sort of system dynamics solves that problem. So the reputation is kind of irrelevant. And the reason for that is the following. So Bitcoin doesn't solve this problem. And it's surprising how many newcomers have this expectation that, well, let's say I'm a vendor and I send out a case of beer or something like that, and should I expect to receive Bitcoin first? If I receive Bitcoin first, do I have an obligation to send out a case of beer, right? I mean, it's obvious to you and me that, yeah, sure, you should be sending out that case of beer for money that you received, but because sort of like this anonymous nature where if you're sitting behind, firewall and you're in Kazakhstan and you have a website that says, I'm going to send, a box of goodies if you send me Bitcoin, there's no reputation system, there's no settlement layer that guarantees delivery, right? There's nothing that's built into it. And it's you go back to the old system of settlement, which is you have to have either a trusted third party, or a reputation system, or both, or some sort of way to clear the transaction and link somehow the transaction to the physical delivery. So cryptocurrencies don't solve that problem, I'm sorry to say. You have to build that system on your own. And some crypto systems solve this whenever you're sending out like digital assets. So Ethereum is one. So you can pay in Ether for some token, right? There are some decentralized networks that are being built, or the exchanges are being built, and on really simple example is CryptoKitties, where you have smart contracts and say, well, I'm gonna pay 1 Ether for this CryptoKitty with this certain aspect of it, and because you can keep track of smart contract on chain, you can do a swap of funds to digital goods, but there's no such thing for swapping funds to physical goods. There's at least not at this point. There's no clean way to do it. That's it for me, but I will open up to questions. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
So what are some, just piggybacking what you just finished there, what are some solutions that some people are trying to do to implement a add-on solution for this?
Right. So one way to do it, I think, is let's think about how you would actually physically have this. So maybe a way to do it is, let's say you have a locked container, and the only way to get access to what's in the container is by sending Bitcoin to it. That's one way to do it. But then you're still trusting the vendor. So it's always a dynamic between, who gets to hold on to the money first, right? So there's a clear way to do it. Another way to do it is have a sort of like trusted third party that has escrow, and there is a company that does it, and it's called Local Bitcoin. And basically, Local Bitcoin, how it works is you deposit Bitcoin into their escrow account, and then what they do then is, once the transaction happens and both say, yeah, we transacted, we're gonna release the fund, and Bitcoin goes to one person, US dollar goes to another person. It's kind of like physical good delivery, and that sort of works. And people have transacted millions of dollars through Local Bitcoin. I'm not getting paid for it, so I wish they would, but anyways, yeah. So that's one way to do it, and that seems to be sort of like the standard way to do it. Even let's say I'm transacting with you on US dollar basis. Like there's a and let's say I'm selling sandwiches and you have $10, right? And there's a split moment where either I have to have the dollar or you have to have the sandwich. So if you give me the dollar first, there's a social obligation where I have to give you the sandwich, but I have both at some point, right? So it's not a difficult problem to solve. It's just the concept of like how would you build a mechanism around it so that it's sort of foolproof. And it's still a big problem, kind of like eBay and refunding people for things that are not their own fault. Sorry, I don't have a very satisfactory answer.
Good, thank you.
Yes. Did you raise your hand? Oh, okay. Any other questions? Do you have questions about maybe like cryptocurrency fundamentals? Is everybody an expert?
Yeah, so fundamentally, can you comment on the energy costs associated with all that?
Sure. Oh, yeah. So energy cost. Okay, I know a lot of people say, oh, this is going to destroy the Earth. The answer is no. It's not going to destroy the Earth. Earth is very massive. It's got a lot of solid rocks underneath it. So if anything, only the sort of like troposphere surface of it will be destroyed. But jokes aside, it's an energy intensive process. And the reason why it's energy intensive is because you have to make it expensive enough so that the attackers are not going to willy-nilly spend the energy. And that's why in the Bitcoin, there's an economic incentive built into the structure, which is, well, if you group the transactions together, we're going to give you a Bitcoin. We're going to not exactly give you a Bitcoin, but give you the right to write in the first line of transaction record a claim so that you can get Bitcoin out of it. Now, if you're a miner and you buy all these infrastructure, you've already spent fiat, and at some point you intend on turning profit, and you have operating margins, right? So you're paying in electricity, and you pay in labor, and you whatever the depreciation of assets. So all of that is built into their profit system, and the beauty of it is that Bitcoin is worth enough where it's worthwhile. So when miners use that electricity, they're actually securing the network by spending that electricity. They're getting paid for it, so every kilowatt that miners use is actually been paid for. So that's the one way to think about it. Unless you get government subsidies, and in which case that's kind of broken. Yes.
Just in terms of mining, I have a coworker here. She is pretty vested in the world of cryptocurrency, blockchain technology. She claims that for the average person who's just entering this world, such as myself, that mining is an ineffective way of actually investing in the world because there's just so many people already that there's not enough, I guess, equations to solve.
Right. So the question is it worth now to mine anything? Answer is yes. So at some scale, it's working. So otherwise, you wouldn't have miners in large operations in Iceland or in China. And China is a kind of special case because they get kickbacks and all that stuff. But at least in other countries, like for example, Thailand and places like, Arizona, I guess people make it worthwhile. And if you have a rig that is able to pay for itself because of the appreciation, it's sort of like, what is it? It's a net present value, right? And you calculate sort of your opportunity cost versus of just built-in inflation of the money versus the future expected value. And you say, okay, well, future expected value is higher. Maybe that's fallacious, but then you go out and do it. If it appreciates enough, you make money. If it crashes, then you have to sell all your mining equipment. And a lot of the miners do go out of business, and they sell their mining equipment. So the answer to that question is, it depends on what asset and how early on the stage you are. So let's say you're the one who created the currency, right? And it relies on mining to get reward and to secure the network. Then, yeah, it's worth it. If you're on the ground floor, then it's worth it. If you're not, and sort of like you're in the middle, then you're kind of playing this game where is it going to go through the roof? And if it is, when? So it really depends on the case. There are, cryptocurrency, you can always fork the code, and people have done it to Bitcoin just to game the system, right? So it's not as though there's infinite space in cryptocurrency. That's one thing to think about. It's not like real estate, right? Like you have titles and people who own it and all that stuff. Like there are history, but you can make your own currency. Okay. Other questions? Yes.
Can you articulate the risk of proof of stack? Because proof of work, you have to put money in order to mine. But the proof of stack seems like once you acquire something,
right,
and then you own more, maybe voting power or something like that.
Yeah.
Will those master nodes vulnerable to be attacked?
Yes. I mean, you can always be DDoS to death if you're a master node, and if you don't have sophisticated, security, then someone can just, let's say you're on a master node, right, and you just have it on your desktop, then you're just done for. Don't do that, please. So it really depends on the sophistication of the attack, and we can foresee what the attackers are going to do. It has to do with how paranoid you are, and like with anything, but it's not limited to it's not a problem inherent in proof of stake. So like the security threat, but the fact that masternode could be taken over is a serious threat, as opposed to completely decentralized network where Bitcoin, everybody can try their hand at creating a transaction record, right? So that's a different model. So it's possible that you can subvert the network just by taking over certain key nodes, but it really depends on how well secured they are. And maybe in some proof of stake systems, you have millions of masternodes, right? If you have millions of masternodes, then it's impossible. Maybe it's less possible that all of them are going to be subverted.
So another question is it possible to backtrace the IP address of masternode?
Yes, absolutely. In public internet, it's trivial.
Then we can allow you DDoS.
You could, but there are ways around it. You can, make it difficult for them to DDoS you, and it really depends on how much money you want to spend and how determined you are and how determined the attackers are. Hopefully that answers your question. Yes.
You said DDoS a couple times. What does that mean? What is that?
Distributed denial of service. So what that means is they just keep on sending you crap. Like maybe it's a malformed transaction that you are forced to calculate, or maybe it's a just more in the spam attack of different kind. I don't know enough about the base layer of TCP/IP to be able to like tell you what those attacks are, but there certainly are. And in fact, Dan Kaminsky's talk does cover some of that, some aspect of that. And yeah, you absolutely can tell whose IP address that is. Any other, like maybe more recent event you guys you have questions on? Yeah.
Hi, good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you again.
Recent, I'm an investor, right? So I look at quite a few cases right now. They are doing so-called proof of useful work. How feasible that?
Oh yeah, I'm not too familiar with distinction, but I gave the way that I think of it is maybe something like this. So proof of work requires that for every solver of a particular block to be added onto a blockchain, there's going to be millions of people who kind of drew a blank, right? So when they pull lottery tickets out of a hat, some of them win, others don't. And so then when they say proof of work, it's actually the entire hash power of the network. So maybe there's a clever way to say, reduce the amount of work that's required, but to keep the security up. Maybe that's part of what they mean by proof of useful work. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, they use the development chips to do the AI machine learning.
Yeah.
As a way of useful work.
Oh yeah, I mean, if that's the definition, then there are a couple different plays that I've seen. So one is like, in the traditional sense, there are like 3D render farms or like CFD, which is computational fluid dynamics, kind of like distributed work that's required in order for certain problems to be solved in a parallelized fashion. So like, let's say you're an HVAC company, right, and you want to have a lot of different computers solve a sort of like heat flow of a particular AC system. And so you send out a chunk of work, and a bunch of people solve it, and people who solve it gets a little bit of token or something like that. Maybe that's what it means. Okay. Any other questions? Like then I can maybe open it up to online people. Oh, okay.
All quiet here.
Jeez. If there are no questions, then we'll adjourn. But I mean, if you have more questions, I'll be happy to cover them. And then I have the presentation from previous slides, previous talk, so I can actually share that with you as well. Yeah, I'll be here. So, you have a question?
Is it possible to locate all the miners where they are located?
Yeah. So number one, if they broadcast a block, a solved block, then you know for sure that they're a miner. And two, maybe there's a way to figure out who belongs to what, mining pool, so to speak. You can kind of get aggregate sense of what the hash power is. Now, can you tell whether so like earlier we talked about like connecting to every node and figuring out who's who, right? So yeah, you can connect to every Bitcoin node and try to see if they're a miner or they're just a iPhone wallet or something like that. Just by looking at their behavior, it's not inherently clear that they are a miner or a full node, but by looking at like what they broadcast and what they don't do, maybe that's the way to do it.
So if they solve a block now, are they getting around 20 Bitcoin?
I think it's like 12 or something like that right now. Yeah, and then it halves every few years. Some 100,000 numbers of blocks. I don't know the exact number, unfortunately. Yeah, and so it's sort of like it's an asymptotically, the rate of inflation decreases over time. That's what we were saying. Yeah. Go ahead.
Just another elementary question. In terms of software knowledge and coding knowledge, to start a rig, what is your
okay, so to start a mining rig, it doesn't require a whole lot of knowledge. So you just have to buy, go do a research on what GPUs you want to buy or ASIC mining rigs you want to buy. There are maybe 5 or 6 different ASICs vendors. Bitmain is one of them. Inno Silicon is another. Dragon Silicon or something like that, that's another. And Bipal Mining, that's another. So there are 5 or 6 ASICs vendors. And then GPU-wise, there's 2. So you can go buy any kind of cards, and then you just need to be able to put together a desktop and maybe even have a milk carton so you can put them in open air. And then you install a GPU mining software, some of which are kind of suspect. So like a miner software, you kind of have to deal with it in a very suspicious fashion because someone's just giving you arbitrary binary. It's not like they could be doing some malicious stuff. So you want to look at the reputation of the GPU miner software and don't hook that machine directly into your home network, please. And GPU miner software generally take a little bit of cut as a part of the deal for making the software available. But you just generally need to be able to connect to a network and then set up the machine and turn it on and join the mining pool or something like that.
So by your home network, you just set up a separate VPN?
Yeah. I mean, you could do it that way, or you could just have a little bit more sophisticated router that can separate out a home network into 2 different subnets, and so that way, like your desktop computer isn't in the same subnet as the mining network. So that way, there's no way for them to kind of mess around with the rest of your like file servers or media servers or whatever. Yeah.
Got a question from the live stream.
Sure.
Brian Murray asks, how are you preventing fraud of POPP?
How are you preventing fraud in POPP? Okay, yeah. So that's specific to metal, and so metal is I meant not to plug too much of my employer, but they asked. So metal is a cryptocurrency that sits on the Ethereum chain right now, and the way that we reward users is to have peer-to-peer transaction in fiat is then rewarded in metal. And so like you're gonna ask, well then I can just like keep sending money back and forth between people, and we're just gonna accumulate metal until we drain your account, right? Answer is no. So there's a sort of like anti-cycling measures that we've already are developing right now, and there's going to be a pretty sophisticated way to detect that in the network. And one of the things is like I'm not giving away how it's going to work, but it's pretty similar to how like if you think about basic attention token, so they have what's called basic attention metrics. So even if you spend 1 million hours in one website, and the content provider for that one website isn't going to earn linear scale amount of BAT, right? It actually is a gradually decreasing amount until the additional amount of time someone's time spent in their website isn't going to reward you that much more BAT. So think of it kind of similar to that, maybe a little different. Any other questions?
Let's talk about some politics and regulation.
I'm sorry?
Can you talk about the politics and regulation?
Oh yeah, I'm not a lawyer, of course. I'm not an expert. But I can tell you a few things. So politics and regulations. So different countries deal with cryptocurrencies in a different way. In some cases, they flat out outlaw it. In other cases, they turn it into a state enterprise, like what you heard about Venezuela and Petro. But they don't know how to operate it, so I don't see the point of it. In other cases, they prevent a fiat to crypto transaction. In case of China, there's no way for you to kind of like convert cryptocurrency into Chinese yuan or something like that, right? So in other cases, it's free. They freely let you do it. In Germany, for an example, if I recall, long-term gains on cryptocurrencies are taxed at 0% rate, or something like that. So there are other places where they're very friendly toward crypto, other places are not. Now, so the different countries have gotten together and they started to think about how to prevent money laundering. So in most cases, if you open an exchange account, because you're dealing with fiat, meaning the national currencies, you have to go through a KYC AML process. And KYC is know your customer, AML is anti-money laundering. And the degree to which information you have to give is depending on the jurisdiction of their operation. So in case of US, it has to do with the amount that you transact, but the guidelines are not very clear. And sometimes they ask about like everything. In other cases, they don't ask that many times. If you open up an account in crypto to crypto exchange, you generally are dealing with less KYC. Tax-wise, there is a variety of ways to deal with taxation, and also the sort of sideline to that is that different countries think of crypto in a different way. In case of Japan, they think cryptocurrencies are currencies. In case of US, they think that the cryptocurrencies are assets. In Wyoming, they have different aspects of what the cryptocurrency is. And recently, they passed a law that is very friendly to cryptocurrencies, but that's only for that state. So there's a national guideline, and there's not so much. And if you follow Keith Orbois, who's very, you know him from PayPal, right? He has one interpretation of sort of like what non-utility tokens are going to be handled. So he said that if there are secondary markets, then just by virtue of secondary markets' existence, it's going to be handled as security. So that was his opinion. There are a lot of people who are really a lot more knowledgeable about the legal side of things. It's like a budding enterprise, aside from cryptocurrencies and building side as well. And it really needs to, be dealt with in a parallel fashion. Otherwise, what's the point of doing it, right? I'm sorry, I kind of give you like a half of a answer. Yeah. Oh, and India, there's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag. So they recently outlawed certain class of notes, which means that they could probably extend it to cryptocurrency. But there isn't really a focus on cryptocurrency right now. But Indian population in general, they're also paying a lot of premium. So there are like street level vendors who are selling cryptocurrencies at 30% premium. I mean, that's crazy. So maybe that's an opportunity to open up an exchange there. But you also have to go with a lot of KYC stuff there. Yes?
So for cryptocurrency and ICO, and then it was pretty obvious to us that in the early next year, and almost like 90% of the ICO successfully raised money.
Yep.
But I think end of last year was like 20%.
Yep.
And this year is like probably like as for like business, probably only like 10% or something. So as investors, we actually see it's actually better because you actually scare away the tourists.
Yeah.
So you're seeing more and more interesting projects, and a lot of them actually do not need tokens, but they are contributing to the ecosystem.
Right.
Do you agree, or are you gonna still extend your career in
cryptocurrency? Yes. Yeah. So that's a really good question. So general arc of it is we already had this sort of like Permian explosion of cryptocurrencies, and we had this like meteoric rise of Bitcoin and then equally painful fall. And so what's going to happen to ICO market? Well, I'm not an investor, so I can't tell you. But what I do know is that just from the ground level perspective, so a lot of frivolous plays have been played out. The idea was that because it was harder for Chinese investor to exfiltrate the money out of Chinese economy, if you're a sort of like regional official and you want to move your money out of the country, you either buy a real estate in the United States or Canada, or you buy some assets that are more mobile, right? One of them is cryptocurrency. So the meteoric rise of price and interest in ICO has more to do with the liquidity, meaning that maybe there are equal number of ICOs, but there are so much more money at stake, and because there was a uncertainty about their future, the wealthy people in these sort of like part of the country where the capital control is increasingly becoming more draconian, you tend to see ginormous amount of money flowing out of that, and because of it, you're going to see huge rise in frivolous asset prices, right? Like maybe like if you go to Vancouver, the price of apartments are crazy, right? And so like you have to think of it that way too. It's not just the excitement about the technology, but what are the macroeconomic factors at play where wealthy people, they want to move money out, and how do they do it? I mean, they can buy. I suppose they can, flat out just turn it into cash and move it around, or they can buy jewelry or whatever. Cryptocurrency is just a more recent way of doing it, and the asset price spike shows that. Maybe in the long run they'll make money. I don't know. 5 minutes. Okay. Hopefully that's a satisfactory answer. It's a politically incorrect answer, but hopefully it's satisfactory. But yeah, there are more interesting projects that are coming along. There are more mature review and due diligence is coming back into the system. So I mean, earlier, just up to September or July of last year, it was just like Wild West, right? Like you just write a white paper and you get funded. That's no longer the case, and maybe that's a good thing, or maybe that's a bad thing. I don't know. It's bad in the sense that some of the fringe idea or crazy idea don't get funded. Like the idea that could be the next big thing, because the investors are now a little bit more guarded about their future. And in any investment activity, you kind of have to take this like leap of faith, unfortunately, right? Like even if you do even if you spend an enormous amount of time and effort like doing due diligence, at some point you have to say, okay, do I put money in it or not? Does it feel like a good investment? And maybe the right way of thinking about it is, what's the long arc? And the long arc is that maybe the cryptocurrency will be a really valuable tool, or it's not. So you make directional bets on that. And so if you pick sort of like the best of the breed, and you'll be doing fairly well. Think of it like real estate. The New York City or Manhattan real estate, if you graph it from say 1600s onward, it's a parabolic graph, right? And that's due to human activity. It's not just by virtue of that land mass. It's the fact that it's actually a commercial entity. Okay, hopefully that was useful, entertaining at the very least. Thank you for attending, and I'll be doing one more talk, and that's going to be sort of like talking about practical aspect of it. Who are the stakeholders? How did they operate? What are their interests? What are some of the other things that are coming up on the cryptocurrency space? And maybe I'll answer more questions about this. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jay. So Jay's next session is on the 26th of March in San Francisco. So we've got a bigger venue there, so hopefully a lot more people will attend. Also, you'll receive a link to the video, so if you missed out on part of the presentation, you'll get a link to that, plus the first session, where he also went through a lot of great stuff. So again, let's give a hand to Jay.